Hey family, welcome to Mr. Gray Family, where every story begins with us. She didn't know it yet, but the same family laughing at her that night would barely be able to SPK when they discovered who her husband really was. Detroit looked exhausted that Friday night. Snow pressed against the sidewalks in uneven piles while traffic crawled slowly through the west side streets. A tire shop near the corner kept blinking open in red lights that faded every few seconds like the sign itself was tired of working. Two women hurried into a beauty salon beside a liquor store carrying oversized purses against the cold. Somewhere down the block, music drifted out of a passing charger before disappearing into the winter air. Inside Patrice's family grill, the windows fogged from heat and conversation. Birthday balloons floated lazily above crowded tables while old Motown played softly behind the noise of forks, laughter, and people talking over each other, the way families always do when nobody wants the night to end early. Elizabeth sat near the center of the long table beside her cousin Danielle, smiling whenever somebody looked her way. At 29, she had perfected that smile. The polite one, the version that hid irritation, embarrassment, and exhaustion all at once. Her dark green sweater fit neatly against her shoulders, and her braids rested carefully over one side as she reached for her glass of water. Anybody watching her from across the restaurant would probably think she looked calm. She wasn't, because the conversation had already turned toward the same subject it always turned toward whenever her family gathered. Marriage. Danielle leaned back in her chair with wine in one hand and laughed. I'm just saying, Liz. At is point, we need to start signing you up for speed dating or something. The table burst into laughter. Elizabeth laughed too, not because it was funny, because not laughing usually made things worse. Across from her, Aunt Cheryl shook her head dramatically. No, seriously, every holiday we ask the same question. When are we finally getting a wedding? Another cousin jumped in immediately. Forget the wedding. We trying to see babies. More laughter. Elizabeth pressed her lips together politely. Can I at least get through my fries first? That earned another round of jokes. But underneath the noise, she could already feel that familiar heaviness settling into her chest, the kind that showed up every time people treated her life like unfinished business. And honestly, what made it worse was the fact that everybody at that table knew what had happened 6 months earlier. Her ex-boyfriend Terrence had married somebody else. Fast, painfully fast. Detroit families carried news the way church ladies carried purses, everywhere and loudly, especially after wine. Danielle smirked. See? That's what happens when you waste years on men that don't know your value. Elizabeth forced another laugh. A small one this time, because hearing another woman become somebody's wife only months after being told I'm not ready for marriage still hurt more than she admitted out loud. For a second she looked down at her plate just to breathe. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. One of her cousins wiped his mouth with a napkin before looking over casually. So hold on. He pointed his fork toward her. This Robert dude, what exactly does he do? The table quieted almost instantly. Not fully silent, just enough for Elizabeth to notice people waiting, watching, judging before she even answered. She swallowed carefully. Maintenance work, she said softly. The reaction came immediately. One cousin nearly choked laughing. A maintenance man? Another relative leaned toward her sister but spoke loud enough for everybody to hear anyway. Girl, after all those years in college? A few people laughed harder than they should have. Others exchanged those subtle little looks families think nobody notices, the looks that say, you could have done better. Elizabeth smiled politely again, but underneath the table her fingers tightened slowly around the fork in her hand. Honestly, nobody there realized how badly those comments landed. Because it wasn't really about money, it was the disappointment in their faces, like she had somehow failed an invisible test, like peace and kindness meant less than a job title. And the worst part, Robert wasn't even there to defend himself. Welcome to Mr. Gray Family, a storytelling universe built for people who crave meaning, emotion, and unforgettable narratives. Here, every story begins with a spark, and ends with a feeling you'll carry long after the video DS. Love, betrayal, family, secrets, lessons, it's all here wrapped in immersive narration that casts you forget everything else. If you're searching for stories that pull your heart, challenge your mind, and keep you coming back, subscribe now. Your story begins the moment you choose to stay. The dinner finally ended almost an hour later, but the comments stayed with Elizabeth the entire drive home. Snowflakes tapped softly against her windshield while downtown Detroit glowed faintly in the distance through the cold haze. Traffic moved slowly along the wet streets, red brake lights stretching endlessly ahead of her like tired little rivers. An old Anita Baker song played quietly through the speakers. Usually that kind of music relaxed her. Tonight, it just made her think too much. Elizabeth tightened both hands around the steering wheel as Danielle's voice replayed in her head again. She wasted her pretty years. That one stayed with her, not because she believed it completely, but because some small part of her feared everybody else did. At a red light, she glanced at her reflection in the mirror. 29, still renting an apartment, still attending weddings instead of planning one, still explaining herself to people who measured happiness by rings, houses, and vacation photos online. She exhaled slowly and looked back at the road. The truth was, she had already tried the impressive man before. Terrence wore expensive watches, talked confidently, always knew the right thing to say in public, and somehow she still spent years feeling lonely beside him. Robert was different, quieter, gentler, but now her family had planted something ugly inside her mind. For the first time since meeting him, Elizabeth wondered if loving somebody peaceful would always come with embarrassment attached to it. That thought made her feel guilty almost immediately, because Robert had never once made her feel small. Not once. The snow kept falling as she drove deeper into the city, old R&B filling the silence while her headlights slid across tired Detroit buildings carrying stories nobody ever talked about out loud. Elizabeth met Robert 3 weeks before that dinner, and honestly, their first conversation should have been a disaster. A heavy snowstorm had rolled through Detroit that morning, covering sidewalks, parking meters, and half the cars downtown in thick gray slush. By noon, everybody inside Elizabeth's office building looked irritated. Wet coats, cold hands, long faces. The elevator stopped between floors right after Elizabeth stepped inside, carrying coffee and 2 folders against her chest. The lights flickered once, then everything froze. Elizabeth's stomach dropped immediately. Oh my God. No, no, no. She pressed the button repeatedly while the elevator sat unmoving between floors. Beside her, a man wearing work boots and a dark jacket looked up calmly from his phone. Robert. At the time, she didn't even know his name yet. He pressed the emergency button once, then leaned lightly against the wall like this happened every Tuesday. We're probably fine, he said casually. Elizabeth stared at him. Probably? He shrugged. Okay, maybe that wasn't the best word choice. Despite herself, she laughed a little. Just enough for him to notice. For the next few minutes, Robert kept talking to her calmly, while maintenance worked on the issue downstairs. Nothing forced. Nothing overly charming. Just easy conversation. At one point, he pulled a crushed granola bar from his jacket pocket and held it up seriously. If we're trapped in here longer than 2 hours, I'm charging you half. Elizabeth laughed harder than she expected, the kind of laugh that escaped before sadness could stop it. And for the first time in months, somebody noticed the difference immediately. Robert looked at her carefully for a second before speaking again. That sounded like your first real laugh all day. The words caught her off guard. Most people talked to impress her. Robert paid attention instead. That was different. Something about him felt emotionally quiet in a way she couldn't explain yet. Safe. And what Elizabeth didn't realize at that moment was that the man her family would later mock the most was secretly wealthier than every person sitting at that dinner table combined. Stay until the wedding, because the moment Robert's real life was exposed completely changed the room. By the time Elizabeth finally brought Robert around her family, the damage had already started. Elizabeth met Robert 3 weeks before that dinner. Their first conversation happened inside a broken elevator during one of the worst snowstorms Detroit had seen that winter. By noon, half the city already looked irritated. People rushed through downtown with wet boots and folded shoulders while snow covered parked cars almost to the windows. Inside Elizabeth's office building, everybody carried that same exhausted Friday energy. She stepped into the elevator balancing coffee and folders against her chest just before the doors closed. Robert stepped in right behind her wearing work boots, a dark jacket, and snow melting slowly from his sleeves. The elevator moved 2 floors, then stopped hard. Elizabeth grabbed the wall immediately. No. No, no, no. The lights flickered once before settling again. She pressed the button repeatedly while her breathing got quicker by the second. Beside her, Robert stayed strangely calm. He pressed the emergency button once, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. We're probably okay, he said. Elizabeth looked at him. Probably? A small smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. All right. Bad choice of words. That tiny joke broke through her panic faster than she expected. For the next several minutes, Robert kept talking to her casually while they waited. Nothing forced, nothing smooth, just calm conversation that somehow made the small elevator feel less suffocating. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and held up a crushed granola bar. If this turns into a survival situation, he said seriously, I'm charging you half. Elizabeth laughed. A real laugh this time. Not the fake polite kind she gave her family earlier. And Robert noticed immediately. "That sounded like your first honest laugh all day." The words caught her off guard. Most people waited for their turn to speak. Robert paid attention instead, and what Elizabeth didn't realize yet was that the man her family would later mock the most was secretly wealthier than every person Ting at that dinner table combined. Stay until the wedding, because the moment Robert's real life was exposed completely changed the room. By the time Elizabeth finally brought Robert around her family, the damage had already started. Patrice's family grill stayed loud the entire night. Somebody near the back kept laughing too hard at jokes that were not that funny. Plates clattered endlessly against tabletops, and every few minutes the front door opened, letting cold Detroit air slide briefly through the restaurant, before disappearing again beneath the smell of fried catfish, buttered rolls, and wine. Danielle loved attention, so naturally her birthday dinners always turned into full productions. Matching gold decorations covered the table. Half-melted candles leaned sideways near the cake. Phones stayed out constantly. Pictures, videos, boomerangs, people fixing collars and hair before every camera flash like the internet needed proof they were happier than they actually felt. Elizabeth sat quietly beside Danielle while her cousin scrolled through engagement photos from another relative's vacation wedding in Miami. "That venue alone probably cost $30,000, Danielle said. Aunt Cheryl nodded approvingly. "See, that's what happens when a man is really prepared." Another cousin laughed. "Prepared financially, you mean?" "Exactly." The women around the table immediately started comparing husbands again. Who bought houses first, who paid every bill, who upgraded their wife's car, who took vacations every year, who owned businesses. The conversation moved fast, overlapping constantly. Elizabeth mostly stayed quiet, pushing roasted potatoes around her plate while listening. This was normal in her family. Nobody directly said money mattered more than love, but they talked about marriage the same way sports fans talked about championships. Winning mattered, and according to them, winning usually looked expensive. Danielle suddenly leaned toward Elizabeth. "So when are we getting your wedding?" The table reacted immediately. "Oh Lord, here we go." She dodging the question again. "At this point we need a countdown timer." Elizabeth laughed softly and reached for her drink. "Y'all act like I committed a crime." "A crime?" Danielle said. "No. But 29 in this family without a ring? They about to put you on the prayer list." The table exploded again. Elizabeth smiled because smiling kept people from looking too closely. But honestly, nights like this exhausted her. Not because her family hated her. They didn't. That was the complicated part. Most of them genuinely believed they were helping. They thought pressure created success, marriage, children, big homes and better neighborhoods. Those things meant stability to them. Especially growing up the way they did. Aunt Cheryl pointed her fork toward Elizabeth carefully. "Baby, you're beautiful, educated, smart. I just don't understand why you keep ending up with men that waste your time." Elizabeth looked down briefly. There it was, Terrence. Nobody said his name yet, but he entered the conversation anyway. Danielle finally did it herself. "Well, Terrence definitely wasted enough years." A few people groaned immediately. "Oh, don't start." "No, seriously," Danielle continued. "That man married somebody else 6 months later." 6? Another cousin shook her head dramatically. "Men know what they want quickly. That's all I'm saying." Elizabeth kept chewing slowly, even though her appetite had disappeared almost 10 minutes earlier. That sentence still hurt more than she liked admitting. Because part of her still remembered sitting in Terrence's apartment listening to him explain why he wasn't ready for marriage. Then suddenly he was ready. Just not with her. Detroit families carried information fast. By the time Terrence posted wedding pictures online, half the city already had opinions about Elizabeth's relationship before she even processed the breakup herself. Danielle touched Elizabeth's shoulder. "I'm just saying you deserve somebody established this time." The word established sat heavily on the table. Everybody understood what it meant. Money, status, security people could photograph. Elizabeth forced another smile. "I'm doing all right. But are you happy?" Aunt Cheryl asked. That question almost caught her off guard. For a second, the table actually became quieter. Elizabeth opened her mouth carefully, because the honest answer was confusing. Robert made her feel calmer than anybody she'd dated in years. Safer, too. But none of that sounded impressive enough for conversations like this. Before she could answer, one of her cousins leaned forward curiously. "So hold on. This Robert guy," he pointed slightly with his fork. "What exactly does he do?" Elizabeth paused. "Not long. just enough to notice everybody paying attention suddenly. "Maintenance work," she answered softly. The reaction hit immediately. "A maintenance man?" somebody repeated. One cousin laughed so suddenly he nearly spilled his drink. Danielle looked surprised before quickly trying to hide it. Then came the comment that settled into Elizabeth's chest like weight. "Girl, after all those years in college?" A few people laughed under their breath. Others exchanged those quiet little family looks people think nobody notices. The disappointed ones, the judgmental ones, like she had somehow dropped below expectations without realizing it. Elizabeth smiled politely again, but underneath the table, her hand tightened around the fork slowly enough that her knuckles almost turned pale. Nobody asked whether Robert treated her kindly. Nobody asked whether she felt loved. Nobody asked whether she finally felt emotionally peaceful after years of feeling alone beside Terrence. Only one thing mattered: what Robert looked like on paper. And sitting there surrounded by relatives, laughter, and half-empty wine glasses, Elizabeth slowly realized something painful. Everybody at that table thought she had settled. By the time Elizabeth finally left the restaurant, the snow had gotten heavier. The parking lot looked washed in dull orange light from the street lamps above, and cold wind pushed sharply against her face the second she stepped outside. Behind her, Danielle's laughter still floated faintly through the restaurant doors before disappearing once they closed again. Elizabeth pulled her coat tighter and walked toward her Honda slowly. The same words kept replaying in her head. A maintenance man? After all those years in college? She deserves somebody established. It wasn't even the jokes themselves that bothered her most. It was how normal they sounded. Like everybody at that table truly believed a person's value could be measured by salary, cars, or neighborhoods. She unlocked the car and sat there quietly for a second before starting the engine. Anita Baker played softly through the speakers almost immediately. Usually that kind of music relaxed her. Tonight, it only gave her more room to think. The windshield wipers dragged slowly across the snow while she pulled onto the street, passing small corner stores, old apartment buildings, and tired bus stops filled with people trying to get home before the roads became worse. Detroit looked worn down in winter. Not broken, just tired, like a city carrying too many memories at once. Elizabeth rested one hand against the steering wheel while traffic crawled ahead of her. For a while, she drove in silence. Then, unfortunately, her mind drifted back to Terrence again. That happened more than she liked admitting, not because she still wanted him. That part had died long ago, but heartbreak had a strange way of replaying old embarrassments when people pressed on fresh insecurities. Terrence always looked successful, even when he barely had money himself. Perfect jackets, designer belts, expensive birthday dinners charged to credit cards he complained about later. Everything with him felt polished for public consumption, and for years Elizabeth convinced herself that meant stability, until she realized she spent most nights sitting beside a man who barely listened whenever she spoke. She remembered crying quietly once in Terrence's bathroom after a terrible argument while he stayed in the living room scrolling through sports highlights like nothing happened. That relationship taught her something painful. A man could look successful and still make a woman feel emotionally alone. Robert never did that. Even in small moments, he paid attention naturally. If she skipped lunch, he noticed. If work stressed her out, he heard it in her voice immediately. If she got quiet, he asked questions instead of changing the subject. Nobody in her family talked about things like that, because kindness was harder to show off than luxury. At a red light, Elizabeth glanced briefly at her reflection in the mirror. Snow reflected softly across the glass, while downtown lights shimmered faintly behind her. 29. Single until recently. Still renting, still driving the same Honda. Still walking into family gatherings feeling like unfinished business. She sighed quietly. The truth was, part of her understood why her family thought the way they did. Most of them grew up struggling. Money meant safety to them. A good husband meant fewer hardships, less stress, better schools for children, a nicer neighborhood. They believed they were protecting her from disappointment, but somewhere along the way, protection started sounding a lot like judgment. And now Robert sat directly in the middle of it. That thought made guilt settle heavily into her stomach, because Robert had done absolutely nothing wrong. He showed up consistently. He treated her gently. He never tried to impress her with fake confidence or loud promises. And somehow, she still found herself embarrassed tonight. Not by him, by the possibility of people looking down on her because of him. Elizabeth hated herself a little for even thinking that. She turned into her apartment complex slowly while snow covered the edges of the parking spaces in uneven piles. The building looked old from the outside, but it was clean enough inside. A few windows still glowed from televisions and kitchen lights while somebody upstairs played music low enough to vibrate faintly through the walls. After parking, she carried her purse and keys upstairs quietly. Her apartment greeted her with familiar warmth, soft lamp lighting, folded blankets on the couch, the faint smell of vanilla from an old candle she forgot to blow out earlier that morning. Peaceful, simple, real. Elizabeth slipped off her boots near the door and stood there silently for a moment. Then her phone buzzed. Robert. Just one message. You make it home okay? That was it. No pressure, no long speech, no unnecessary questions. Just concern. Elizabeth stared at the screen longer than she meant to, and suddenly, the noise from dinner felt far away for a second. She typed back slowly. Yeah, just got in. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Good. Roads looked bad tonight. Elizabeth smiled faintly despite herself. Then her eyes drifted toward the kitchen counter where Danielle's words came rushing back again. She wasted her pretty years. Her chest tightened slightly, because now another thought had started growing underneath everything else. A dangerous one. What if introducing Robert to her family ruined this relationship before it truly had a chance to grow? Elizabeth looked down at her phone again carefully. For the first time since meeting him, she honestly didn't know if she wanted Robert anywhere near people who measured love the way her family did. Elizabeth met Robert on a Tuesday morning that almost everybody in Detroit seemed irritated by. The snowstorm started before sunrise and kept getting worse hour after hour. By the time she reached the medical supply office downtown, her boots were soaked near the ankles, her fingers felt numb, and half the employees walking through the lobby looked one inconvenience away from arguing with strangers. Elizabeth adjusted the strap of her purse while balancing coffee and folders carefully against her chest. Her phone buzzed again with another family group message. Danielle had already uploaded birthday pictures. Somebody commented, "Next celebration better be Liz's engagement." Another relative added laughing emojis underneath. Elizabeth rolled her eyes softly and slipped the phone back into her coat pocket just as the elevator doors opened. A man stepped in behind her right before they closed. Tall, quiet, dark jacket dusted with snow near the shoulders, work boots, tired eyes. He nodded politely but didn't try forcing conversation the way most men did in elevators. Elizabeth appreciated that immediately. The elevator climbed 2 floors smoothly, then suddenly jerked hard enough to make her grab the railing. The lights flickered once. Everything stopped. Elizabeth blinked. No. The elevator stayed still, completely still. "Oh, come on," she muttered quickly, pressing the button several times. "No, no, no." Beside her, the man remained calm, almost suspiciously calm. He pressed the emergency button once and listened quietly before leaning back lightly against T-wall. "We're probably okay." Elizabeth turned toward him immediately. "Probably?" A small smile touched his face. "All right," he admitted. That sounded more comforting in my head. Despite herself, she laughed once through the panic. Just a quick little laugh. But it changed the air inside the elevator almost immediately. The man noticed. "See?" he said gently. "That's already better than screaming." "I wasn't screaming. You were spiritually screaming." Elizabeth looked at him for a second before laughing again. A real laugh this time. Not the polite fake one she used around family dinners, not the careful professional one she used at work. An actual laugh, the kind that slipped out before sadness could stop it. The elevator still hadn't moved. Outside, faint mechanical sounds echoed somewhere through the shaft while snow continued hitting the building beyond the walls. Elizabeth exhaled slowly and adjusted the folders in her arms. "I hate elevators." "Really?" he asked. "Getting trapped in one usually improves people's opinions." She shook her head, smiling. "You do this with everybody?" "Only people who look like they're planning their escape route." That made her laugh again. For the next several minutes, conversation started flowing naturally between them. Easy, unforced. He asked where she got her coffee, because apparently the lobby cafe made sad coffee for tired people. She admitted she drove 15 extra minutes every morning, just to avoid drinking it. He respected the commitment, small things, but somehow, the longer they stood there, the less trapped Elizabeth felt. That surprised her. Most men she dated worked hard to sound impressive immediately. This man barely talked about himself at all. Instead, he paid attention, real attention. When she rubbed her hands together from the cold, he noticed. When her breathing calmed down, he noticed that too. At one point, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crushed granola bar. He stared at it seriously for a second before holding it toward her. "If this situation gets worse," he said, "we split resources equally." Elizabeth covered her mouth, laughing. "You carry emergency granola bars?" "I work long hours. Sometimes lunch becomes ambition instead." That line caught her off guard a little. Not because it sounded smooth, because it sounded honest, and honesty felt strangely rare to her lately. The elevator finally jerked slightly again before moving downward slowly. Both of them relaxed immediately. "Thank God," Elizabeth breathed. "See," he said calmly, "near-death experiences really bring people together." She shook her head, smiling, while the doors finally opened into the lobby again. 2 maintenance workers stood outside, apologizing immediately. Elizabeth stepped out first before turning back toward him. "Thanks," she said. "For what?" "For talking me down." He shrugged lightly. "You look like you needed somebody on your side today." The sentence landed softly somewhere deep in her chest. Because he was right. She really did. For a second, neither of them moved. Then he extended his hand casually. "Robert, Elizabeth." He repeated her name once quietly, like he wanted to remember it properly. And strangely enough, that small moment stayed with Elizabeth longer than she expected, because for the first time in months somebody made her feel calm instead of emotionally hostage. Have you ever met somebody who made life feel calmer instead of harder? After the elevator incident, Elizabeth honestly expected never to see Robert again. Detroit was big enough for people to disappear into routine quickly. Everybody rushed somewhere. Everybody carried stress. Most strangers stayed strangers. But 3 days later, she walked into the lobby cafe before work and heard a familiar voice behind her. "You switched coffee locations on me." Elizabeth turned around, smiling before she could stop herself. Robert stood near the entrance, holding a paper bag in one hand, while snow melted slowly off his jacket sleeves. "I thought you hated this coffee," she said. "I do," he answered. "But now I'm emotionally invested in seeing whether you survive Monday mornings." She laughed softly, shaking her head. That became the beginning. Not fireworks, not dramatic flirting, just small conversations that slowly started stretching longer. Some mornings they grabbed coffee before work. Other evenings they ended up talking in the parking garage long after everybody else left downtown. Nothing about Robert felt rushed. That mattered to Elizabeth more than she expected. Terrence used to treat relationships like presentations. Everything had to look impressive immediately. Fancy reservations. Expensive gifts early. Big promises before emotional honesty ever existed. With Robert, things unfolded quietly. One Friday evening, they drove 20 minutes just to buy tacos from a small restaurant Robert claimed had life-changing hot sauce. It nearly killed him. Elizabeth sat in his truck laughing while Robert drank from a large cup so fast he started coughing halfway through. "You okay?" "No," he admitted painfully. "I think you're people trying to punish me. My people. You watched me suffer. You said you could handle spice. I lied with confidence." That laugh returned again, the real one, and Robert noticed every single time, not in a performative way, not like men who pointed out emotions just to sound emotionally intelligent. He simply paid attention naturally. That difference kept staying with her. A few weeks later, Elizabeth came downstairs from work looking exhausted after a terrible meeting with her supervisor. She hadn't even realized how irritated she looked until Robert glanced at her carefully and handed her a bag without explanation. "What's this? You skipped lunch." Her eyebrows lifted immediately. "How do you know that? You get quieter when you're hungry." Elizabeth stared at him briefly. Nobody noticed things like that about her. Not usually. Inside the bag sat grilled chicken, fruit, and a small chocolate chip cookie. "You bought me a stress cookie?" she asked. Robert shrugged lightly while unlocking the truck. Felt medically necessary. She smiled all the way home. The strange part was how ordinary everything felt with him. No games, no confusion, no disappearing for hours just to create fake mystery. If Robert said he would call, he called. If he said he was coming, he showed up. And slowly, Elizabeth started relaxing in ways she hadn't realized she stopped doing years ago. One night they sat inside his truck outside her apartment building while soft music played through the speakers. Snow rested lightly along the edges of the windshield, while people hurried through the cold carrying grocery bags and backpacks toward nearby apartments. Robert looked over at her. "Can I ask you something?" "Depends. That doesn't sound promising." She smiled faintly. "Go ahead. When's the last time somebody took care of you?" The question surprised her enough that she looked away immediately, because honestly, she couldn't remember, not emotionally, not without conditions attached. Terrence always liked being admired, needed it almost. If Elizabeth struggled emotionally, somehow the conversation usually found its way back to him, but Robert listened differently. like understanding her actually mattered. Elizabeth rubbed her hands together slowly. I'm used to handling things myself. Robert nodded once. Yeah, I noticed. There was no pity in his voice. That mattered too. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Robert reached over quietly and pulled one of her cold hands into his. Simple, gentle, no performance attached to it. Elizabeth felt her chest tighten unexpectedly, not from sadness, from relief, and honestly, that scared her a little, because peace felt unfamiliar after spending years in relationships where she constantly had to earn reassurance. Robert squeezed her hand lightly. You think too much. I do not. You absolutely do. She laughed softly. You barely know me. I know you apologize before asking people for favors. Elizabeth blinked once. I know you pretend to be okay faster than most people notice. She looked down quietly. And, he added, I know you don't let people help you very often. The truck became very still after that. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Elizabeth realized then that Robert saw parts of her she spent years hiding under politeness and independence. And strangely enough, instead of feeling exposed, she felt safe. Weeks passed that way. Coffee runs, late-night conversations, quiet drives through Detroit after work, small touches growing more natural. Elizabeth resting her head briefly against his shoulder during traffic lights, Robert brushing snow carefully off her coat before she walked inside. Little things, the kind that slowly build trust without announcing themselves loudly. And somewhere in the middle of all those ordinary moments, Elizabeth noticed something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Not fantasy, not pressure, just the quiet possibility that maybe love was supposed to feel peaceful instead of exhausting. Elizabeth waited almost 3 weeks before bringing Robert around her family. Not because she was ashamed of him, at least that's what she kept telling herself, but every time Danielle called asking questions or Aunt Cheryl mentioned successful men, Elizabeth felt this tight nervousness settle into her stomach. She already knew how her family measured people, and Robert didn't walk into rooms trying to impress anybody. That worried her more than it should have. Sunday dinner happened at Aunt Cheryl's house on the west side. The entire place smelled like fried chicken, baked macaroni, sweet potatoes, and candles that had been burning since early morning. Football played loudly in the living room while relatives drifted between the kitchen and dining room carrying paper plates overloaded with food. The second Robert's old pickup truck pulled into the driveway, Elizabeth noticed Danielle glance through the curtains. That was the first warning sign. You nervous? Robert asked softly after turning off the engine. Elizabeth forced a small smile. You asking me or yourself? Fair point. He looked calm. Of course he did. Meanwhile, Elizabeth felt like she was about to introduce two completely different worlds to each other and pray they behaved. Inside the house, conversations paused briefly when they walked in together. Not dramatically. Just enough for Elizabeth to notice. Danielle hugged her first before turning toward Robert politely. So you're finally real. Robert smiled slightly. Last time I checked. A few people laughed. The tension loosened for maybe 30 seconds. Then the questions started. They always did. At first everything stayed harmless, where he grew up, how long they'd been dating, whether he watched football. But Elizabeth knew her family well enough to recognize the shift once people settled around the table with drinks in their hands. Aunt Cheryl sliced into the cornbread carefully. So, Robert, Elizabeth mentioned you work in tenants? Robert nodded once. Yeah, what kind? Building operations mostly. His answers stayed simple. Too simple for a room full of people searching for status clues. One cousin leaned back in his chair. That enough money in Detroit these days? Elizabeth immediately looked down at her plate. There it was. Robert stayed calm. Pays my bills. Another relative laughed lightly. Man, bills don't stop once you get married. Danielle tried softening the moment. They're just looking out for Elizabeth. Robert nodded politely again. I understand. Elizabeth hated how relieved she felt hearing him stay patient. Because deep down, she already expected things to get worse, and unfortunately, they did. One of her cousins glanced toward Elizabeth before speaking directly to Robert again. So what's the long-term plan? Robert looked genuinely confused. For taking care of her. The table got quieter. Elizabeth felt heat crawl slowly into her face. Robert answered carefully. I plan to love her well. Everything else gets figured out together. That should have been enough. It wasn't. Another cousin laughed into his drink. That sounded nice politically. A few people chuckled under their breath. Elizabeth stopped eating completely, because suddenly she could feel the judgment happening in real time around her. Not loud, not explosive, just constant little cuts disguised as conversation. Questions nobody asked wealthy men. Questions designed to measure whether somebody deserved respect. Aunt Cheryl tilted her head slightly. Elizabeth always dated ambitious men before. The sentence hung there awkwardly. Robert understood exactly what she meant. So did everybody else. Elizabeth wanted the floor to open beneath her chair. But Robert surprised her again. Instead of becoming defensive, he reached calmly for his water. Ambition looks different on different people, he said quietly. Nobody answered immediately after that. Football commentary filled the silence for a second from the other room. Danielle cleared her throat and tried changing the subject. So Robert, you dance? Robert looked horrified. Absolutely not. Out of the room. Even Elizabeth smiled again. For a few minutes things relaxed slightly. But tension never fully disappeared. Elizabeth could still feel people studying him, measuring him, trying to decide whether she made a mistake. By the time dinner ended, her chest felt exhausted from pretending everything was fine. Robert helped carry empty trays into the kitchen without being asked. Thanked Aunt Cheryl for the food, shook everybody's hand politely. And somehow that made Elizabeth feel even worse, because despite everything, he stayed kind. The drive back to her apartment happened mostly in silence, not angry silence, heavy silence. Streetlights passed slowly across the windshield while Robert kept one hand resting loosely against the steering wheel. Elizabeth stared out the window the entire ride. When they finally parked outside her building, she opened the door quickly before speaking. I'm sorry. Robert looked over immediately. For what? You heard them, so did you. That answer broke something loose emotionally inside her. Elizabeth shook her head quickly and climbed out before he could see tears forming. By the time she reached her apartment bathroom, she was crying harder than she expected. Not dramatic crying. The quiet, painful kind. The kind people do when they're embarrassed for feeling hurt in the first place. A soft knock came at the bathroom door a minute later. Elizabeth? She wiped her face quickly. I'm fine. Robert stayed quiet briefly from the other side. No, you're not. Something about how gently he said it made her cry harder. Elizabeth opened the door finally, avoiding eye contact immediately. I just hate that they think like that, she whispered. And I hate that you had to sit there through it. Robert looked at her for a long moment, before stepping closer carefully. Then he did something Terrence almost never did. He held her without trying to fix the moment immediately. No speeches, no ego, just warmth. Elizabeth rested her forehead against his chest while trying to calm her breathing. They don't know you, she said quietly. Robert kissed her forehead softly. They don't really know you either. The apartment became still around them after that. Warm lamplight. Muted city noise outside, the sound of her breathing finally slowing. Later that night, they sat together on the couch sharing leftovers straight from the container while old sitcom reruns played quietly in the background. At one point, Elizabeth looked over at him carefully. You're not embarrassed of me? Robert looked genuinely confused. Elizabeth, why would I be? And honestly, that question stayed with her long after he fell asleep beside her. Because Robert never once made her feel like she needed to earn love through performance. A few days after the dinner at Aunt Cheryl's house, Elizabeth started noticing little things about Robert that didn't fully match the life he claimed to live. Nothing dramatic, just details that quietly stayed in her mind longer than they should have. One Wednesday evening, she sat inside his truck eating fries while Robert drove through downtown traffic after work. The radio played softly while headlights reflected across the windshield in long streaks of white and gold. Robert's phone rang through the truck's speakers briefly before he muted it almost immediately. Elizabeth glanced over casually. The screen only showed Mr. Ellis. Robert declined the call without explanation. 30 seconds later, the phone rang again. Same name. This time Robert sighed softly before answering through Bluetooth. Yeah. His voice changed slightly, not colder, just more focused. Elizabeth stared quietly out the window while listening without trying to listen. No, don't move the numbers yet, Robert said calmly. Wait until Monday morning. A pause. No. If you panic now, everybody else panics too. Another pause. I'll handle it. Then he hung up. Elizabeth looked over carefully. Work problems? Robert nodded once. Something like that. He didn't elaborate. And strangely enough, she didn't push. That became one of the unusual things about their relationship. Neither of them forced conversations before the other person felt ready. A week later, Elizabeth noticed another detail. Robert paid for dinner with an old black credit card she had never seen before. Nothing flashy about it. Actually, the card looked almost plain. But the waitress reacted differently the second she saw it. Her posture straightened immediately. "Thank you, sir." Elizabeth noticed the change but said nothing. Robert acted like he didn't notice at all. Then there were the clothes. Not designer loud. No giant labels. No gold chains. But everything fit perfectly. Good fabric, clean lines, the kind of jackets people bought once and kept for years because they were expensive enough not to wear out quickly. None of it matched the image her family created in their heads when they heard maintenance worker. But honestly, Elizabeth didn't spend much time thinking about money around Robert. That surprised her too. Because with Terrence, money stayed in every conversation somehow. How much something cost, who had better seats, which restaurants mattered, who looked successful enough online. Being with Robert felt different, simpler. One Friday night, Elizabeth fell asleep briefly on Robert's couch while a basketball game played softly in the background. When she woke up, Robert stood near the kitchen speaking quietly on the phone. "I'm not coming to the fundraiser." A pause. "No, because I already know what those rooms are like." Elizabeth stayed still, pretending to sleep while listening. Another pause. "I said no." His voice remained calm, but there was exhaustion underneath it now. Not work exhaustion. Something deeper, the kind people carried after disappointment that lasted years. Robert rubbed one hand slowly across his forehead. "I'm not interested in meeting another woman who thinks money is a personality trait." Silence. Then finally, "Good night." He ended the call and stood there quietly for a second before turning around. That was when he noticed Elizabeth awake. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Robert smiled faintly. "You hungry?" No panic, no awkwardness, no scrambling to explain himself. Elizabeth sat up slowly. "Who was that?" "My brother." She nodded once. That answer technically explained the call, but not really. Still, she let it go. Because everybody carried private disappointments, and Robert never pressured her to explain every scar from her past either. Later that night, they sat on the couch sharing Chinese takeout while snow drifted softly beyond the apartment windows. Elizabeth rested against him comfortably, while Robert absent-mindedly played with her fingers. "You ever think people get tired of pretending?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him. Pretending what? That they care about the right things. The question sat between them for a second. Elizabeth thought about Danielle. Aunt Cheryl, Terrence, all those conversations about appearances, status, image, she answered honestly. "Yeah. I think some people forget who they are trying to impress after a while." Robert looked at her carefully after that, long enough that she noticed. And something softened in his expression almost immediately, because Elizabeth still didn't ask him what kind of car he wished he drove. She didn't ask how much money he made. She didn't treat kindness like a temporary substitute for success. She simply liked him. That mattered more to Robert than she realized. Much more. Later that night, after Elizabeth fell asleep against his shoulder, Robert looked down at her quietly while muted television light moved across the room. For the first time in years, being around somebody felt peaceful instead of transactional. And honestly, that scared him a little too, because Elizabeth still had no idea who he really was. If somebody loved you before knowing your status, would you ever forget it? By March, Robert had quietly become part of Elizabeth's everyday life. Not in the loud, dramatic way relationships sometimes happened around her family. Nothing about them looked performative. There were no social media countdowns, no staged date night photos, no matching outfits posted online with captions pretending life was perfect. Most evenings looked simple. Robert picking her up after work, take-out bags between them in the truck, music low enough for conversation, Detroit lights passing outside while they talked about everything and nothing for hours. And honestly, Elizabeth started realizing those ordinary moments meant more to her than all the expensive dinners Terrence ever paid for. One Friday night, Robert texted her around 6. "Wear something warm." That was the entire message. Elizabeth smiled while putting her phone down. When Robert arrived outside her apartment almost an hour later, the first thing she noticed was how tired he looked. Not unhappy, just worn down from work. His dark jacket rested open over a gray sweater, and faint cold air followed him into the building lobby when she climbed into the truck. "You all right?" she asked. Robert nodded once while pulling away from the curb. "Long week. You want to cancel?" He looked over at her briefly, like the suggestion genuinely surprised him. "No." Something about that answer stayed with her. Because Terrence used to disappear emotionally any time life became stressful, Robert leaned closer instead. The truck moved quietly through evening traffic while downtown Detroit glowed ahead of them across the riverfront. Street musicians stood near corners wrapped in heavy coats. Couples walked between restaurants holding hands against the cold. Somewhere nearby, music drifted faintly through the night air before fading again beneath traffic noise. Eventually, Robert parked near the Detroit River and reached toward the back seat. Elizabeth blinked. "You brought food?" "Of course." He handed her a warm paper bag. "Please tell me this isn't another attempt to destroy your stomach with hot sauce." Robert looked offended immediately. "One bad taco experience and suddenly my reputation ruined." Elizabeth laughed softly while opening the bag. Burgers, fries, 2 milkshakes balanced carefully in a drink holder between them. Simple, comfort food. The river shimmered quietly beyond the windshield, while both of them ate and talked the same way they had dozens of times before. Easy, comfortable. At one point, Elizabeth reached over and wiped ketchup from the corner of Robert's mouth before realizing what she was doing halfway through. Robert paused. "You just unlocked a dangerous level of intimacy. Oh my God, you feeding me fries next? You're being dramatic." "I'm emotionally overwhelmed." She laughed again and leaned back against the seat, shaking her head. For a little while, silence settled comfortably between them. Not awkward silence, the kind people reached after spending enough time together to stop performing constantly. Robert stared out toward the river thoughtfully before speaking again. "You ever think about how strange relationships are?" Elizabeth looked over. "That's random. I'm serious." He rubbed his hands together slowly. "You spend years around people trying to convince you they're important." He glanced toward her briefly. "Then suddenly one person makes everything feel simple." Elizabeth grew quieter after that, because she understood exactly what he meant. Robert continued staring ahead while speaking softly. "I used to think love had to feel intense all the time. What changed?" He smiled faintly. "I got tired." The honesty in his voice pulled at something inside her chest immediately. Not because the words sounded dramatic, because they sounded real. Elizabeth looked down at the fries resting in her lap. "I think I got tired too." Robert nodded slowly like he already knew. For a second, neither of them spoke again. Outside, lights reflected softly across the dark water while cold wind moved against the truck windows. Then Robert reached into his jacket pocket. Elizabeth expected keys. Instead, he pulled out a small velvet box. Her breath caught instantly. Robert looked almost nervous now. That surprised her more than the ring itself, because this was the first time she had seen him unsure of his words. "I had a whole speech planned," he admitted quietly. Elizabeth covered her mouth, immediately laughing through sudden tears. "Oh God, but now I forgot most of it. That's okay." "No," he said softly, smiling. "I wanted this right." Elizabeth's chest tightened painfully. Not from fear, from how genuine he sounded. Robert looked down briefly at the box in his hands before speaking again. "I know your family probably expected somebody different." The words landed carefully between them. "But I need you to know something before I ask you this." He looked directly at her now. "You are the first person in a long time who makes me feel like I can breathe normally." Elizabeth's eyes filled immediately. Robert exhaled slowly. "You don't make me prove myself every day." Another pause. "You don't make love feel competitive." His thumb rubbed lightly across the edge of the velvet box. "And honestly, I don't care if we ever become the couple everybody talks about." A small emotional laugh escaped Elizabeth through tears. "I just want to keep coming home to you." The truck became completely still after that. No traffic mattered, no city noise, no pressure, just the sound of two people sitting inside one honest moment together. Robert opened the ring box carefully. Simple diamond, elegant, beautiful without trying too hard. Very him. Elizabeth started crying before he even asked. Robert smiled nervously. "I'm hoping that's a good sign." She laughed through tears again. Then finally he asked quietly, "Elizabeth, will you marry me?" There wasn't even a second of hesitation. Yes. The answer came out immediately, certain, Emotional, real. Robert closed his eyes briefly like relief hit him all at once, before Elizabeth leaned forward and kissed him hard enough to interrupt whatever words he planned next. Both of them laughed softly against each other afterward. And somewhere between the river lights, cold Detroit air, unfinished fries and tearful smiles, Elizabeth realized something important. This was the first relationship where love didn't feel like something she had to earn constantly. For the first time in years, she felt emotionally chosen. Elizabeth made the mistake of telling Danielle about the engagement first, not because Danielle was the closest person to her. Honestly, she just hoped starting with one family member might soften everybody else before the news spread fully. It did the opposite. By the next afternoon, 3 aunties had already called her phone. 2 cousins texted asking for pictures of the ring. One relative she barely spoke to suddenly wanted details. Detroit family gossip moved faster than weather. And somewhere underneath all the congratulations, Elizabeth could already hear the judgment forming. Danielle came over that Sunday carrying wine and too much curiosity. The second Elizabeth opened the door, Danielle grabbed her hand dramatically. "Oh, wow! Okay, the ring actually nice." Elizabeth laughed softly. "Thank you." "I'm serious." Robert surprised me. There it was again. That subtle surprise people kept attaching to him. Like kindness from a maintenance worker somehow deserved extra applause. Danielle dropped onto the couch, while Elizabeth poured wine into 2 glasses. "So, when's the wedding?" "We haven't figured that out yet. Please don't do one of those tiny courthouse weddings." Elizabeth handed her a glass carefully. "What's wrong with courthouse weddings?" "Nothing," Danielle answered quickly. "I'm just saying people already talking." Elizabeth paused. That sentence immediately drained warmth from the room. Talking about what? Danielle hesitated too long. Elizabeth already knew she wasn't going to like the answer. Finally, Danielle sighed. "You know how this family is—" "No, say it." Danielle leaned back against the couch. "Some people think you rushing because of Terrence." Elizabeth looked away instantly. Of course his name found its way here too. "They think you scared of starting over at your age," Danielle continued carefully. "And honestly, a lot of them still don't understand the Robert situation." "The Robert situation? You know what I mean." Elizabeth set her wineglass down harder than she intended. "No, I actually don't." Danielle rubbed her forehead. "Liz, don't do this." "Do what?" Act confused. The apartment grew quieter after that. Outside, somebody slammed a car door somewhere in the parking lot while television noise drifted faintly through a neighboring wall. Danielle lowered her voice slightly. "You spent years dating Terrence." Elizabeth crossed her arms immediately. And now suddenly you're marrying a maintenance man 6 months after Terrence marries somebody else." The sentence sat heavily between them. Danielle kept going before Elizabeth could respond. "People think you settling because you tired." Elizabeth stared at her. Not angry yet, just hurt, because hearing strangers judge her was one thing. Hearing Danielle repeat it calmly felt worse somehow. Danielle sighed again. "I'm not trying to be mean, but you don't hear yourself. I'm trying to protect you." Elizabeth laughed softly under her breath. That word again. Protect. Everybody used that word whenever they wanted permission to disrespect her choices. Danielle shifted uncomfortably before finally saying the sentence Elizabeth would replay in her mind for weeks afterward. "I just don't want you waking up one day, realizing you wasted your pretty years." The apartment became painfully still. Elizabeth looked at Danielle for a long second like she genuinely didn't recognize her anymore. Because what exactly were pretty years supposed to mean? Years spent being chosen publicly? Years spent beside impressive men who barely loved you correctly? Years spent performing happiness so other people felt comfortable around your life? Elizabeth swallowed carefully. "You think I'm embarrassing myself?" Danielle opened her mouth immediately. "That's not what I said. You didn't have to." Danielle looked guilty then, but not guilty enough to take it back. The rest of the conversation never recovered after that. Even after Danielle left, the tension stayed inside the apartment like smoke. Elizabeth wandered quietly between rooms while her thoughts kept turning ugly. Maybe her family was right. Maybe everybody saw something she didn't. Maybe Robert loved her deeply but still couldn't give her the kind of future people respected. That thought made her feel sick almost immediately, because none of her doubts came from Robert himself. Every insecurity arrived through somebody else's voice. Her phone buzzed around 9. "Robert, you okay?" Elizabeth stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Yeah, just tired." Another message appeared. You sure? That almost broke her emotionally right there, because Robert somehow always noticed when something felt wrong even through text messages. Elizabeth sat slowly at the edge of her bed while staring down at the engagement ring resting against her finger. Simple, beautiful, honest, nothing flashy about it. Just like him. Turned again. She wasted her pretty years. Elizabeth closed her eyes tightly. Then, before she could stop herself, she slowly pulled the ring halfway off her finger. Not because she stopped loving Robert. Not because she doubted his heart. But because humiliation had finally started reaching places love worked so hard to heal. For the first time since saying yes, Elizabeth wondered whether public judgment could slowly destroy something good. Robert noticed something was wrong 3 days before Elizabeth admitted it. That was the frustrating thing about him. He paid attention too carefully. By Thursday evening, Elizabeth had canceled dinner twice claiming work stress. Her replies became shorter. Phone calls ended quicker. Even when they sat together, part of her attention stayed somewhere else entirely. Robert never pushed immediately, but he watched quietly. That night, he showed up outside her apartment carrying takeout anyway. Elizabeth opened the door wearing oversized sweatpants and one of his old hoodies she accidentally kept after a movie night weeks earlier. Robert lifted the food bag slightly. I brought peace offerings. She smiled faintly. You bribing me with fries again? Historically effective strategy. Normally that would have earned a bigger laugh. Tonight it barely lasted a second, Robert noticed. Of course he did. Inside the apartment, soft jazz played low through her speaker while rain tapped gently against the windows. Elizabeth sat cross-legged on the couch, picking absent-mindedly at her food while Robert watched a basketball game muted on television. Neither of them spoke much at first. And honestly, the silence felt heavier than usual. Finally, Robert reached for the remote and turned the television off completely. Elizabeth looked up immediately. You were watching that? No, I wasn't. A quiet pause followed. Then Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows against his knees. What's happening? Elizabeth looked down at the fries in her lap. Nothing. That answer usually means something. She sighed softly. Part of her wanted to avoid the conversation completely, because saying ugly fears out loud sometimes made them feel more real. But another part of her was tired of pretending family criticism wasn't affecting her, tired of acting untouched by judgment. Robert waited patiently. No pressure in his face, no frustration, just concern. Elizabeth finally spoke quietly. Do you ever feel like people already decided who we are before we even walk into rooms? Robert leaned back slowly against the couch. That sounds like a dangerous question. I'm serious. I know, she swallowed carefully before continuing. My family thinks I'm making a mistake. Robert stayed quiet. Not surprised. Just listening. Elizabeth rubbed nervously at the sleeve of her hoodie. They think I'm settling because Terrence married somebody else first. Still he said nothing. That almost made it easier somehow, because Terrence always interrupted emotional conversations to defend himself. Robert simply gave people room to speak honestly. Elizabeth laughed bitterly under her breath. Danielle said she doesn't want me wasting my pretty years. The sentence sounded uglier out loud. Robert's jaw tightened slightly for the first time all evening. Not anger exactly. Disappointment, maybe. Elizabeth stared toward the window while rain slid slowly down the glass. And the worst part? She whispered. A tiny part of me started wondering if everybody's embarrassed for me. The room became very still after that. Robert looked down briefly before speaking. Elizabeth, she finally looked at him again. You know what I think? What? I think people get addicted to appearances. His voice stayed calm, steady. Some people only understand relationships that look impressive from outside. Elizabeth listened quietly. Robert continued carefully. Big weddings, expensive dinners, perfect pictures online. A small, humorless smile crossed his face. Lives that look expensive enough to make strangers jealous. Elizabeth felt her chest tighten slowly, because every sentence sounded painfully familiar. Robert rubbed his hands together once, before looking directly at her. People who only respect you when life looks expensive usually don't know love very well. The words settled deep. Not dramatic, not rehearsed, just honest. Elizabeth stared at him silently. Robert leaned back slightly against the couch cushions. I'm not saying money doesn't matter. Life gets hard. Bills matter. Stability matters. He shrugged lightly. But if somebody treats you well, protects your peace, shows up consistently. He paused briefly. That should matter too. Elizabeth's eyes started burning again. Not from shame this time, from relief, because Robert never tried competing with her family's expectations. He simply kept loving her steadily while everybody else turned relationships into social rankings. Elizabeth shook her head softly. I hate that this is affecting me. Robert moved closer carefully. It's affecting you because they're your family. That answer loosened something inside her immediately. No guilt, no accusation, just understanding. Elizabeth looked down at the engagement ring still resting on her finger. Earlier that week she almost removed it completely. Now touching it felt different again. Robert reached over gently, taking her hand into his. You know what I noticed about you? He asked quietly. What? You spend so much time trying not to disappoint people. His thumb brushed softly across her knuckles. That sometimes you forget your own happiness counts too. Elizabeth covered her eyes briefly, trying not to cry again. Robert laughed softly. See? Now you got me sounding emotional. You are emotional. Don't spread rumors. That finally pulled a real laugh out of her. Small, but real. The tension inside the apartment shifted after that, not magically fixed, just lighter, more honest. Later that night they sat together at the kitchen table looking through possible wedding venues on Elizabeth's laptop while arguing jokingly about food choices. Robert wanted simple. Elizabeth wanted simple too. For the first time all week, the future stopped feeling embarrassing. And somewhere between late-night conversations, cold leftover fries, and wedding tabs open across the screen, Elizabeth quietly made a decision. She could not spend the rest of her life choosing relationships based on who other people would applaud. Some relationships survive because two people stop trying to impress everybody else. The strange thing about Robert and Elizabeth was how quickly ordinary life started feeling important to both of them. Not exciting in the way social media liked to define relationships. Nobody would have looked at them sitting inside a laundromat at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night and thought, now that's romance. But Elizabeth still remembered laughing so hard that night she nearly dropped a basket of towels. Robert had been trying to fold fitted sheets, trying and failing badly. How are you losing to fabric? Elizabeth asked between laughs. Robert held up the twisted sheet angrily. This thing got too many corners. Ain't no reason for a sheet to fight back like this. You're struggling. I'm being disrespected. She laughed harder while fixing it for him. Little moments like that kept happening, and somehow they mattered more than expensive dates ever did. By early spring, Robert had quietly become part of her routines without either of them forcing it. Saturday mornings usually started the same way now. Robert knocking softly on her apartment door around 10 carrying coffee and breakfast sandwiches. Elizabeth opening the door half awake wearing oversized hoodies while he judged how long she ignored his first knock. You alive in there? Barely. That's comforting. Some mornings they stayed inside watching old sitcom reruns while arguing over breakfast potatoes. Other days Robert drove her around Detroit running errands she secretly hated doing alone. Grocery stores, Target runs, picking up dry cleaning, simple things. But Terrence used to act irritated anytime life became inconvenient. Robert treated ordinary moments like they still deserved patience. One Sunday afternoon, Elizabeth convinced him to attend a family cookout hosted by one of Danielle's friends, not because she trusted the environment completely, mostly because she wanted one normal gathering where Robert didn't feel analyzed every 5 seconds. The music started before they even reached the backyard. Old-school R&B, domino tables, football conversation happening too loudly near the grill, children running everywhere with juice boxes and unmatched shoes. Robert stood near the food table awkwardly watching everybody dance. Elizabeth noticed immediately. You nervous? I don't dance. That's not true. It absolutely is. She grabbed his wrist before he could escape. Come on. Robert looked genuinely concerned now. Elizabeth, you survived my family. You can survive dancing. Unfortunately for him, she was stronger than she looked. 2 minutes later, Robert stood beside her, moving with the stiff rhythm of somebody trying to remember instructions from a safety manual. Elizabeth nearly folded over laughing. Oh my God! Robert pointed at her seriously, while still attempting to move. You said support your partner. I am supporting you. You laughing directly in my face, because this is terrible. Even Danielle laughed from nearby. Robert dancing like somebody uncle at a barbecue. Robert looked offended immediately. Why everybody attacking me today? But eventually he loosened up slightly. Not good, still nowhere near good, but comfortable enough to stop overthinking every movement. And watching that happen softened something inside Elizabeth unexpectedly, because Robert never needed to dominate rooms. He simply adjusted patiently. That mattered more than flashy confidence ever could. Later, while eating barbecue near the patio heaters outside, Robert reached for a bottle of hot sauce without asking questions first. Elizabeth noticed too late. Wait! He poured way too much directly onto his food. Danielle immediately burst out laughing. Oh no! Robert looked confused for exactly 3 seconds before the spice hit him emotionally and spiritually at the same time. Elizabeth covered her mouth laughing while Robert grabbed his drink desperately. Nobody warned me. You were overconfident, Elizabeth corrected. Robert pointed weakly toward Danielle. She set me up. Danielle nearly spilled her plate laughing. And honestly, moments like that slowly changed the atmosphere around him. Not completely. Some relatives still looked skeptical, but people started relaxing around Robert because he never entered rooms trying to prove himself superior. A few weeks later, Elizabeth sat inside her regular hair salon flipping through a magazine while one of the stylists worked carefully through her braids. Naturally, relationship conversations started almost immediately. One woman leaned over smiling. So this fiancé of yours, he treat you right? Elizabeth smiled automatically. Yeah, he really does. Another stylist nodded approvingly. That matters more than all the flashy stuff after a while. Elizabeth paused slightly hearing that. Because honestly, she rarely heard conversations like that around her family anymore. Most people focused on appearances first, but here, surrounded by women discussing real life while dryers hummed in the background, the conversation sounded different. More honest. That stayed with her the rest of the day. Later that evening, Robert sat on her apartment floor helping assemble cheap furniture she ordered online. Or technically, attempting to help. This table got too many screws, he muttered. You said that about the sheets, too. Furniture shouldn't require emotional suffering. Elizabeth laughed softly while tightening another bolt. Then she looked over at him quietly for a second. Robert glanced up immediately. What? Nothing. That's suspicious. She smiled to herself. Because somewhere between football Sundays, bad dancing, grocery runs, cheap furniture, takeout, dinners, and late-night conversations, their relationship stopped feeling temporary, stopped feeling fragile. Without either of them realizing exactly when it happened, ordinary life started feeling good together, and honestly, that frightened Elizabeth less and less every day. For the first time in years, love didn't feel like something she had to constantly protect from collapse. It simply started feeling like home. By late October, wedding conversations started feeling real enough to scare both of them a little. Not the relationship itself. That part felt steady now. It was everything surrounding marriage that suddenly carried weight. Budgets, guest lists, family expectations, venues, opinions from people who somehow treated weddings like public performances instead of personal commitments. One Thursday night, Elizabeth sat cross-legged on her couch surrounded by bridal magazines, venue printouts, and a notebook filled with scratched-out numbers, while rain brushed softly against the apartment windows. Robert stood in the kitchen, heating leftovers while pretending not to notice her staring aggressively at a calculator. "You're making battle plans over there?" he asked. Elizabeth sighed dramatically. "Weddings are expensive." Robert walked over carrying 2 plates carefully balanced in his hands. "You just realizing this now? I thought napkins came free. They do not." She rubbed her forehead tiredly while looking down at the numbers again. "And apparently flowers cost the same amount as rent now." Robert sat beside her, smiling faintly. "You know we don't have to impress people." Elizabeth looked up immediately. "I know, but even saying those words sounded complicated." Because part of her still carried old family pressure quietly in the background. She wanted the wedding to feel beautiful, not because strangers needed approval, but because she was tired of feeling judged for every relationship decision she made. Robert handed her a plate. "Eat before you declare financial war on centerpieces." She laughed softly despite herself. For a while they sat together eating in comfortable silence while wedding notes covered half the coffee table between them. Then Elizabeth asked the question she had been avoiding for weeks. "You ever get nervous?" Robert looked over. "About marrying you? About marriage?" He leaned back slightly against the couch cushions. "Honestly? Please." "Yeah." The honesty surprised her less now than it would have months earlier. Robert no longer pretended to have perfect answers around her. Elizabeth set her plate down slowly. "What scares you?" He stared quietly toward the rain-covered windows for a second before answering. "Failure." That answer landed heavier than she expected. Robert rubbed his hands together slowly. "I've watched people stay married while completely miserable." Elizabeth listened quietly. "I've watched couples care more about appearances than each other." A humorless smile crossed his face briefly. "Half the people giving marriage advice don't even like the person they go home to." Elizabeth laughed softly under her breath. "That's unfortunately true." Robert looked down at his hands. "I just never wanted that." For a second the apartment became very still again. Not tense, just honest. Elizabeth understood that fear more than she wanted to admit, because growing up around constant conversations about status sometimes made marriage feel transactional instead of emotional. Like love only counted if it looked successful enough publicly. She pulled her knees closer against the couch while speaking quietly. "You know what scares me?" Robert looked over immediately. "That one day you'll wake up and realize my family was too much trouble." The sentence escaped before she could soften it. Robert stared at her for a second, like he genuinely hated hearing that thought exist inside her mind. "Elizabeth, I'm serious. You think I'd leave because your relatives talk too much?" She smiled weakly. "When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous. Because it is ridiculous." But her expression stayed uncertain. Robert noticed. Of course he did. He shifted closer beside her. "You want to know something?" "What?" "The first time I met your family," Elizabeth groaned immediately. "Please don't relive that evening." "I'm serious." He smiled slightly. "I realized something very quickly." "What?" "You spent your whole life around people teaching you how relationships should look." Elizabeth grew quieter. "Because he wasn't wrong," Robert continued carefully. "And somewhere in all that noise, nobody taught you that being emotionally cared for matters too." That sentence sat deep, not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded painfully accurate. Outside, rain continued sliding down the windows, while distant traffic hummed softly through the night. Elizabeth looked down at the engagement ring resting against her hand. "I just don't want us becoming one of those couples pretending everything's okay when it's not." Robert nodded once immediately. "Then we don't." Simple answer, simple tone. But somehow that steadiness mattered. Elizabeth leaned back against the couch quietly. "You really think we can do this?" Robert looked genuinely confused again. "We already are." That made her smile. A real one. Then Robert reached over, brushing his thumb lightly across her hand, before speaking softer this time. "Look, I'm not promising life becomes perfect after a wedding. Good, because you already know I can't dance properly, and apparently furniture assembly defeats me spiritually." Elizabeth laughed. "But I am promising you won't handle hard things alone." The room grew quieter after that, not emotional in a dramatic way, just intimate. Two people finally speaking honestly without trying to sound impressive. Later that night, snow started replacing the rain outside, while Elizabeth stood beside the apartment window watching white flakes drift slowly across the parking lot lights below. Robert walked up behind her, wrapping one arm loosely around her waist. Neither of them spoke immediately. Elizabeth rested gently back against him, warm, tired, thoughtful. And somewhere in that silence she finally understood something important. No relationship would ever impress everybody. Some people would always measure love through appearances first. But standing there inside that small apartment with Robert holding her quietly against the cold Detroit night, Elizabeth realized she would rather feel emotionally secure than socially impressive. The morning of the wedding arrived cold and gray over Detroit. Not dramatic weather. Just one of those quiet winter mornings where the city looked half awake beneath low clouds and wet streets. Elizabeth barely slept the night before. By 8:30, the bridal suite already buzzed with noise, hair tools heating, makeup brushes clicking against counters, music playing softly from somebody's phone near the mirrors. Danielle stood near the window holding coffee, while Aunt Cheryl moved around the room adjusting bags, dresses, and decorations with the nervous energy of somebody pretending not to be emotional. Elizabeth sat quietly in front of the mirror, while one of the stylists pinned the final pieces of her hair carefully into place. For a moment, everything almost felt peaceful. Then the whispers started again. Not directly at her, never directly, but close enough. One cousin walked into the suite carrying her phone. Parking lot already full. Danielle looked up. That many people actually came? Apparently. Another relative laughed lightly. I mean, people love witnessing unexpected weddings. Elizabeth heard it. So did Danielle. The room shifted awkwardly for half a second before everybody pretended nothing happened. Elizabeth looked down at her hands quietly. The engagement ring caught soft light from the mirror bulbs, while nervousness settled heavier into her stomach. Not fear about Robert. Never that. Fear about the room. The opinions. The judging. The possibility that people still viewed this marriage like a mistake waiting to happen. Danielle walked over carefully after the others drifted toward the hallway. You okay? Elizabeth nodded too quickly. Danielle noticed immediately. You know, she said softly, you can still breathe today. Elizabeth laughed weakly. I'm trying, and honestly, Danielle sounded kinder lately. Still imperfect, still carrying opinions sometimes, but softer than before. Maybe guilt changed people slowly, or maybe watching Robert consistently love Elizabeth finally forced some relatives to question their assumptions. Downstairs near the venue entrance, Robert adjusted the cuffs of his dark suit while standing beside his old pickup truck. The same truck everybody judged the first day they met him. Snow rested lightly across the edges of the parking lot while guests arrived in waves carrying coats, gifts, and opinions. One older relative glanced toward the truck before muttering under her breath, He really drove that to his wedding? Another answered quietly, At least wash it first. A few people laughed softly. Robert heard them. Elizabeth would later realize he heard far more than he ever reacted to. But standing outside the venue that morning, he simply closed the truck door calmly and thanked one of the attendants helping direct guests inside. No ego, no irritation, no performance. That unsettled people more than arrogance would have. Inside the bridal suite, Elizabeth stood near the window adjusting the sleeves of her robe while trying not to think too much. Then her phone buzzed. Robert, one message. You all right? Elizabeth stared at the screen for a second before smiling softly despite the nerves crushing her chest. Trying to be. 3 dots appeared immediately. Me too. That almost made her emotional again. Because while everybody else focused on appearances, Robert somehow still focused on her. Even today. Especially today. A knock sounded at the bridal suite door moments later before Aunt Cheryl stepped back inside. You got visitors arriving downstairs, she said. Danielle looked confused. Visitors? Aunt Cheryl nodded slowly. Fancy ones, apparently. Elizabeth frowned slightly. What does that mean? Before Aunt Cheryl could answer, another relative rushed down the hallway, visibly confused. There's like 5 black SUVs pulling in. Danielle blinked. For whose wedding? Nobody answered immediately. More vehicles followed behind them. Large black luxury cars sliding quietly into the parking area one after another, while valet arcades suddenly straightened their posture near the entrance. Guests started noticing now. Conversations slowed. People turned toward the windows. One man stepped out wearing a dark wool coat and expensive leather gloves before speaking briefly to another older gentleman near the entrance. Then both men looked toward Robert and smiled immediately. Elizabeth noticed Danielle staring now. So, Robert knows them? Nobody knew, not yet. Downstairs, Robert shook hands calmly with the older men like the interaction was completely armale. One of the businessmen laughed warmly before clasping Robert's shoulder respectfully. Even from upstairs, Elizabeth could feel the atmosphere shifting slightly. Confusion first, then curiosity, then something quieter, something uncomfortable. A few seconds later, one of the older businessmen smiled toward Robert again before saying clearly enough for several nearby relatives to hear, Good morning, Mr. Robert. The room changed after that. Not loudly, not instantly, but enough for everybody to feel it. And at that moment, the entire room started realizing they may have judged the wrong man. The shift inside the wedding venue happened slowly enough that most people didn't realize it immediately. At first, everybody kept pretending nothing unusual was happening. Relatives continued fixing dresses. Guests kept taking pictures near the floral wall. Music still floated softly through the ballroom while servers carried trays between tables. But attention had already moved. Conversations started shortening. Eyes kept drifting toward the entrance, because more luxury vehicles continued arriving outside. Not flashy in an obnoxious way, just expensive enough that people noticed immediately. Danielle stood near one of the front windows, trying very hard not to look obvious, while watching another older man step from a black SUV wearing a tailored charcoal coat. He spotted Robert instantly, smiled, then walked directly toward him with his hand already extended. "Robert, good to see you," the older man laughed warmly. "You disappear for months and suddenly I find out you got married before the board does?" Several nearby relatives heard that clearly. Danielle's expression changed first, then Aunt Cheryl's, because the sentence didn't sound like somebody greeting a maintenance worker. Not even close. Outside, Robert smiled slightly while shaking the man's hand. "You still talking too much," he answered calmly. The older man laughed harder. "That means yes." Another luxury vehicle pulled in behind them. Then another. Guests near the entrance started stepping aside automatically as more businessmen entered the venue, greeting Robert with familiar respect. Not fake respect either. The comfortable kind people only gave somebody they genuinely valued. Elizabeth watched everything from upstairs beside the bridal suite doorway, while confusion slowly spread through the room around her. One cousin frowned. "Wait, who are these people?" Danielle crossed her arms slowly. "I don't know, but Elizabeth noticed something important immediately." Robert looked exactly the same. Same posture, same voice, same simple dark suit. No sudden personality change, no arrogance appearing now that important people surrounded him. That unsettled her almost more than the reveal itself. Downstairs, another older businessman approached Robert, smiling broadly. "You finally decided to stop hiding from everybody?" Robert sighed softly. "I wasn't hiding, sure." The man looked around the venue before lowering his voice slightly. "Your grandfather would have loved this." That sentence landed heavily near the entrance. A few relatives exchanged confused looks immediately. "Grandfather? What kind of family conversation was this?" Danielle stepped closer toward the hallway quietly. "You knew about this?" she whispered toward Elizabeth. Elizabeth shook her head slowly. Because honestly, she knew nothing. Not really. And somehow, that realization didn't make her angry. It made her emotional, because suddenly dozens of little moments started rearranging themselves differently inside her memory. The strange business calls, the quiet confidence, the old black credit card, the businessmen calling him directly, the expensive jackets without visible labels. Robert never lied to her. He simply never corrected assumptions people made about him. Downstairs near the ballroom entrance, one of Aunt Cheryl's cousins approached a businessman curiously. "So how y'all know Robert?" The man looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Know Robert?" He smiled lightly. "Robert owns the company that supplies half the industrial contracts across eastern Michigan." Silence. Real silence this time. The kind that physically changes rooms. Another relative blinked immediately. "Owns?" The businessman nodded casually. "His family's owned those companies for decades." Danielle's mouth opened slightly before closing again. Nobody knew what to say, because suddenly every conversation from the past year sounded ugly in hindsight. Every little joke, every judgment, every assumption. And meanwhile, Robert still stood near the entrance, greeting people politely, like none of it mattered. No smirk, no performance, no public humiliation. Elizabeth felt something tighten painfully in her chest then. Not embarrassment, not shock, something deeper. Because she realized Robert protected her dignity the entire time. He could have exposed everybody months earlier, could have embarrassed her family effortlessly. Instead, he allowed people to reveal themselves naturally. That mattered. Inside the bridal suite, Danielle finally spoke quietly. "Elizabeth." But Elizabeth barely heard her. Her attention stayed downstairs, on Robert, the same man who folded fitted sheets terribly, the same man who carried breakfast sandwiches to her apartment, the same man who panicked over hot sauce at cookouts. Nothing about him suddenly felt different to her. Only everybody else changed. That realization almost made her cry. A few minutes later, Aunt Cheryl walked slowly into the bridal suite, looking emotionally unsettled for maybe the first time in Elizabeth's life. "You knew?" she asked carefully. Elizabeth looked over. "No." Aunt Cheryl sat down quietly near the mirror. For a second, she looked older somehow. Not physically, just reflective, like years of assumptions were replaying themselves all at once. Downstairs, another businessman approached Robert, smiling warmly. "You really kept this hidden from her family?" Robert glanced briefly toward the upstairs balcony where Elizabeth stood watching. Then he answered simply, "I wanted people to meet me before they met my money." That sentence traveled farther than he intended. Several relatives heard it clearly, and suddenly the atmosphere inside the venue changed again, not toward excitement, toward discomfort. Because nobody could honestly deny what happened anymore, they judged him immediately, measured him immediately, reduced him immediately, and Robert never once treated Elizabeth differently because of it. Elizabeth looked down at the engagement ring resting against her hand while emotions crowded heavily inside her chest. Then slowly, she started smiling. Not because Robert was wealthy, not because her family was finally impressed, but because nothing about her feelings changed after learning the truth. She already loved him before any of this mattered, and somehow that became the most important thing in the room. The wedding ceremony itself felt strangely emotional after the reveal, not because the venue suddenly became more beautiful, not because Robert looked richer standing at the altar, but because the entire room now watched him differently, and everybody knew it. Elizabeth noticed the change immediately while walking down the aisle. The same relatives who once whispered about Robert's truck now stood straighter whenever he passed nearby. People smiled harder, laughed louder at his jokes. Conversation suddenly sounded overly polite. It would have been funny if it wasn't so uncomfortable. Robert, meanwhile, behaved exactly the same. That part almost fascinated Elizabeth. He still thanked servers respectfully, still opened doors for older relatives, still adjusted her chair before sitting down beside her during the reception. No performance, no victory lap, just consistency. And honestly, that consistency exposed everybody else more than arrogance ever could. During cocktail hour, Danielle approached Robert carefully near the dessert table. Elizabeth noticed immediately from across the room. Danielle smiled awkwardly. "So, you really own all those companies?" Robert looked mildly uncomfortable already. "My family does." Danielle laughed softly, like she suddenly needed to sound warmer than usual. "You definitely kept that quiet." Robert picked up a glass of water calmly. It never felt important. That answer visibly confused her, because for people like Danielle, status always mattered. That was the language most of the family understood best. Danielle leaned against the table slightly. "You know everybody's shocked, right?" Robert smiled faintly. "I noticed." There was no bitterness in his voice, no smugness, and somehow that made Danielle look even guiltier. Across the ballroom, Aunt Cheryl sat quietly speaking to another relative while occasionally glancing toward Robert with an expression Elizabeth had never fully seen on her before. Regret, maybe, or embarrassment, probably both. At another table, one cousin who barely acknowledged Robert months earlier now suddenly asked detailed questions about business investments and Detroit real estate. Elizabeth nearly laughed into her drink listening to it happen. The shift felt so obvious now. And the strangest part? Robert never gave people opportunities to feel attacked. He answered politely. Short answers, respectful tone, no showing off, no stories designed to embarrass anybody. One businessman approached Robert during dinner and shook his hand firmly. "Your grandfather used to say character reveals itself faster when people think you have nothing." Several nearby relatives heard that sentence too. Silence followed almost immediately afterward, because everybody understood the implication. Robert glanced briefly toward Elizabeth before answering quietly. He was usually right. Elizabeth felt warmth spread through her chest hearing that. Not because of the money, because Robert still protected everybody's dignity even after they failed to protect his. That mattered deeply to her. Later in the evening, Elizabeth stepped briefly onto the balcony outside the ballroom, needing fresh air away from all the attention. Cold wind brushed softly against her skin, while traffic lights glowed below the city streets. A moment later, Danielle stepped outside beside her, holding a glass of champagne awkwardly. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Danielle sighed heavily. "I owe you an apology." Elizabeth looked ahead quietly. Danielle laughed once under her breath. "Honestly, probably several." The cold air carried the sound of distant traffic between them. Danielle leaned against the railing carefully. "I thought I understood what kind of relationship you needed." Elizabeth finally looked over. "And now?" Danielle smiled weakly. "Now I think you figured it out before the rest of us did." That sentence softened something slightly inside Elizabeth. Not enough to erase everything, but enough to matter. Inside the ballroom, music started again while guests returned toward the dance floor laughing and talking louder now the tension finally loosened. Danielle glanced back toward the doors briefly before speaking again. "He really loves you." Elizabeth smiled automatically hearing that. "Yeah," she answered softly. "He does." And honestly, that became the clearest thing in the entire room by the end of the night. Not Robert's wealth, not the businesses, not the luxury vehicles outside. Love. Real love looked obvious once people stopped staring at appearances long enough to notice it. Back inside the ballroom, one older relative suddenly waved Robert over enthusiastically toward a group conversation. The same man who once joked about maintenance work. Elizabeth watched the interaction quietly from across the room. Robert walked over politely, shook hands, smiled lightly. No attitude, no coldness, no public revenge. And that was when Elizabeth fully understood something important. Money revealed people, not just the people who lacked it, the people who worshipped it too. By the end of the reception, Elizabeth no longer cared who felt embarrassed, because the only opinions that truly mattered had already been revealed long before the wedding day. The people who genuinely loved her happiness never needed Robert to be wealthy before treating him with respect, and the people who suddenly changed after learning the truth told on themselves without realizing it. By the time the reception started winding down, the ballroom finally felt quieter. Not empty yet, just softer. The loud energy from earlier slowly faded into tired laughter, half-finished drinks, abandoned cake plates, and guests slipping coats back over formal clothes while gathering purses and car keys. Outside, snow drifted lightly across the Detroit streets again. Inside, warm golden lights reflected gently against nearly empty tables while slow music carried softly through the room. Elizabeth slipped off her heels underneath the table with visible relief. Robert noticed immediately. "There she is," he said quietly, "the real victim of this wedding." Elizabeth laughed tiredly. "My feet officially surrendered 2 hours ago." Robert leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "You still look beautiful, though." "That's because I'm sitting down." He smiled to himself while reaching for her hand automatically. Simple gesture, natural now, like his hand already belonged there. Across the ballroom, staff members quietly stacked unused chairs while older relatives finished long conversations near the exits. Danielle stood hugging somebody near the coat area, while Aunt Cheryl remained seated alone at one of the side tables, staring thoughtfully into a nearly melted cup of coffee. Elizabeth noticed immediately. "She's been sitting there a while," she whispered. Robert followed her gaze briefly before nodding once. "Go talk to her." Elizabeth hesitated, not because she was angry anymore, mostly because she didn't know what version of the conversation waited for her there. Still, after a second, she stood slowly and walked across the ballroom toward Aunt Cheryl. The older woman looked up the moment Elizabeth approached. For once, she didn't immediately hide behind advice or opinions. She just looked tired, honest. Elizabeth sat beside her quietly. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then finally Aunt Cheryl sighed softly. "I owe you an apology too." Elizabeth looked down at the table briefly. The older woman rubbed her hands together slowly before continuing. "I spent so many years worrying about whether life looked stable." She laughed weakly under her breath. "That somewhere along the way, I stopped paying attention to whether people were actually H-Pi." Elizabeth stayed quiet listening, because honestly, hearing Aunt Cheryl speak without pretending certainty felt unfamiliar. The older woman looked toward Robert across the ballroom. "He never acted different," she admitted softly. "Even after today." Elizabeth followed her gaze automatically. Robert stood near the dance floor helping an older guest gather her coat after it slipped from her chair. Still polite, still thoughtful, still himself. Aunt Cheryl shook her head lightly. "I judged that man before I even knew him." Elizabeth swallowed carefully. "You weren't the only one." "No," Aunt Cheryl admitted. "But I should have known better." For a second, emotion crossed her face too quickly to fully hide. Not dramatic, just regret, real regret. Then she looked directly at Elizabeth. "I think your father would have liked him." That sentence landed unexpectedly deep. Elizabeth lowered her eyes, immediately trying to hold herself together. Because somehow, after all the noise surrounding the wedding, that simple statement mattered more than anything else Aunt Cheryl said all year. The older woman reached over, squeezing Elizabeth's hand gently. "You chose somebody who protects your heart," she said quietly. "That's harder to find than money." Elizabeth felt tears press suddenly behind her eyes again. Not painful tears this time, just relief. Soft emotional relief after carrying years of pressure around relationships. Across the ballroom, Robert looked over, searching for her automatically. The second he spotted her, his shoulders relaxed slightly. That tiny reaction almost made her laugh through the emotion. Even now, after all the reveal and attention, Robert still focused on whether she was okay first. Aunt Cheryl noticed too, and for the first time, she smiled without judgment attached to it. Go dance with your husband. Husband. The word still felt unreal. Elizabeth stood slowly before walking back across the ballroom toward Robert, while the final slow song of the night started playing softly through the speakers. Robert met her halfway. You all right? He asked immediately. Elizabeth smiled up at him. Yeah. He studied her face carefully for half a second longer anyway. Then finally, okay. That made her laugh quietly. Without another word, Robert pulled her gently toward the center of the nearly empty dance floor. No crowd gathered around them anymore. No attention left to perform for, just soft music, dim ballroom lights, and a few remaining guests finishing conversations quietly nearby. Elizabeth rested both hands against his shoulders while Robert held her carefully against him, and for a little while neither of them spoke. They simply moved slowly together beneath the warm lights while snow continued falling outside beyond the tall ballroom windows. Eventually Robert looked down at her, smiling faintly. You know, today got weird fast. Elizabeth laughed softly against his chest. You think? I had a whole plan to stay unnoticed. That failed terribly. Disaster, honestly. She shook her head, smiling. Then, after a quiet moment, Elizabeth finally asked the question sitting in her mind since morning. Why didn't you tell me? Robert understood immediately what she meant. He exhaled slowly before answering. Because I needed somebody to know me without all that attached first. Elizabeth looked up at him carefully. And when you did? Robert's expression softened instantly. You still loved me exactly the same. That answer hit her harder than the reveal itself ever could. Because he was right. The money changed nothing important between them. The expensive cars, the businesses, the shocked relatives. None of it touched the actual foundation of their relationship. Elizabeth rested her forehead gently against his chest while the song continued quietly around them. And honestly, that became the real victory of the story. Not proving her family wrong, not discovering Robert was wealthy, not watching judgment turn into embarrassment. The victory was finding somebody who made love feel emotionally safe instead of emotionally exhausting. By the time the final song ended, most guests had already gone home. Only a few staff members remained cleaning tables quietly, while snow covered the streets outside in fresh white layers. Robert kissed Elizabeth softly against her forehead before pulling her close one last time. And standing there in the middle of an almost empty ballroom, Elizabeth finally understood something people spend entire lifetimes missing. Real love rarely arrives looking impressive at first. Sometimes it arrives quietly, patiently, wearing work boots, driving an old truck, listening carefully, choosing kindness when ego would feel easier. And if you believe character matters more than status, subscribe to Mr. Gray Family and share his story with someone who needs this reminder.